And welcome to the Homelab Show podcast. This is episode number 53. And we got an exciting release here. It's the new Ubuntu 2204 and LTS. Jay is our resident Ubuntu expert because, as we'll comment, he kind of wrote a book on that, maybe even a couple versions of it. So,
Yeah, a few. Yeah, one or two.
one or two. There's always new things to write. There's always new versions. So that's what we wanted to talk about today because April is the release date. Well, is the official release tomorrow? When's their release party? Is it tomorrow essentially when they make the big announcement?
Yeah, it's tomorrow. So that's basically how it works every year. Like, give you a date. And of course, people generally want a time, which makes sense to me. They want to know when they can download it. And I've seen it as early as like 10 in the morning Eastern time, all the way up to like mid-afternoon, depending on when they get the final ISO images ready. So basically, it's not much of a release party. You go in their IRC or any of their chat rooms, and it's literally just dozens and dozens of people asking, is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? Is it ready yet? And the developers are saying, no, 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 over and over again. And then eventually it is, and then they put out the release announcement. So yeah, tomorrow's the release date, which could happen early in the morning, Eastern time, afternoon. I'll be watching, but it'll be tomorrow.
Now, in one extra piece of errata we want to cover here, and I want to put at the beginning, is me and Jay will be having the Homelab show live at PenguinCon, and that's going to be just a couple days. It falls on, I should have the date pulled up, but it's Saturday, the 22nd of April. So April 22, we're going to be doing a special version. Hopefully the internet and everything at the event will allow us to do the show live. Worst cases, we'll just have to record it and post it later. But if anyone's going to be at PenguinCon this year, I know we probably should have announced sooner that we were going there, but we've tweeted about it. We've talked about it. People that kind of follow us know that we've attended PenguinCon in the past. So it's a weird sci-fi literature and Linux convention and open source rolled into one crazy thing. It happens here in the Detroit area. So
so every time I've been there, I've never been able to get a Wi-Fi signal.
Oh, someone said I got the date wrong. I will admit real quick. So yes, it's April 23rd, Saturday. Yeah. So yes. So 23rd. We'll be doing a Saturday edition, provided the internet stays up. Sometimes at conventions with lots of people, internet. So
I feel like there's just to be honest on my part, I mean, that would be great if we could do it live on YouTube there, but I mean, I've never had good luck with their internet. So my opinion is that we'll try, but more than likely we'll be posting it because I hate to be a pessimist about this, but given past experience,
there's a
it's
chance
going to be probably a little difficult to do it live from there. So I guess it's live in person, maybe live on YouTube. We don't know that yet.
Yeah, so I can't make guarantees on it. So, all right, now that we got that out of the way, let's get the show started. And we'll start that by thanking the sponsor of the show. That is Linode. They've been a sponsor for a while. And if you went to our site today and it was down, it's DNS because it's always DNS. It has nothing to do with Linode. And we were just talking before we started the show about moving to Linode DNS. There's a much bigger reason we're not at the moment, and it's not even a good reason. So Jay talked me off the cliff on a lot of things. And
did you realize it's we're on episode number 53 and we're talking about DNS?
Oh man, this is the episode that should have been about DNS. When our episodes align with port numbers. But you can not only host DNS with Linode, by the way, which is really convenient. You can also host all your applications, such as the Homelab show. The good news is the site was up, it was working, and if you had static DNS entries entered, it worked great. If you did not, sorry for the inconvenience. It was down for a couple hours last night. But
I was just telling Tom before we started recording, maybe we should move the DNS for that domain to Linode, and maybe we wouldn't have this problem because Linode is not the DNS we're using for that particular site right now.
So we won't throw any shade at Linode for any of the problems, but we do want to thank them as a sponsor, and many of the projects and things we talk about on this show can absolutely be run in Linode, and maybe they're even ideal to be run in Linode because not everything has to run inside your home lab. Sometimes you need something external facing because you want the public to hit it, and you don't necessarily always want them hitting up your public IP address. So thanks Linode for sponsoring. There's an offer code to get you started with Linode. So head over to linode.com/thehomelabshow. And thanks. Now let's talk about Ubuntu.
Ubuntu 2204 LTS. And the code name is Jammy Jellyfish, which is probably my favorite code name. I mean, they just sound so cool. Yeah, I like it a lot. So there's a lot of different directions to go with this conversation because I'm very mixed about my opinion on this, and I think it's going to surprise a lot of people. There's some good, obviously. There's some like head scratching moments with this release that I want to get into. Well, first of all, I want to start with LTS. I'm not talking about the initials for your company.
Oh,
I'm
I
talking
thought you
about
were talking about
long-term,
me.
yeah, long-term support. So one misconception I want to get out of the way first is that everyone thinks that you get 5 years of support with LTS, which is true on servers specifically. Desktops are 3 years. A lot of people don't know that, so I just wanted to get that out there, which is
I
interesting to
misquoted
me.
that, so I'm glad you clarified that. I admittedly misquoted in a video a long time ago, but the video I should take down because it's old.
I would say in my best guess, like 80% of people don't know that. They read 5 years of support, then they stop, or the it just doesn't mention anything more than that. But what's interesting about this is that even though the desktop edition gets 3 years of support, it's not like they're checking to see if you've installed from the desktop ISO and then withholding updates later. Like it's just kind of confusing a little bit. Um, but yeah, anyway, it comes out tomorrow as of the time we're recording this. It's going to be the 21st is the date that it's supposed to be out. Again, we don't know the exact time. And I'm going to talk about the server edition, obviously, because that's going to be something that is of special interest to the people listening, and also the desktop version as well, because maybe people are running that on their desktop, or they might want to run that on their desktop. So I'm still evaluating the new version of Ubuntu Server. I've spent a lot of time with it, but I'm also, and I guess I'm going to reveal something right now, writing a new edition of my book about it. So I am diving in. I am still learning new things. So there's going to be some things that I'll learn later. But one of the things that I was really looking at here was whether or not ZFS was going to finally lose the experimental heading that
Did
it's been
it?
using for, was it 1604? I think it was 1604
It's
was
been a
the first
while.
release. Yeah. Um, so I can tell you that at least as of today, if I use the daily build of the desktop version, I don't see experimental alongside ZFS anymore. Now, that doesn't mean that they won't put that experimental heading back in there at the last minute, but that was promising. So when I go to the server version, and I literally did this like 30 minutes before we hit the record button on this because I wanted to make sure that I was completely up to date. And the ISO images that they have out right now are possibly final. Assuming that there's no bugs or anything, they're saying that these are the last images that they'll make until they do a point release. So, barring any, last minute changes, the server ISO image that I downloaded this morning has a pretty good chance of being the last one. And ZFS is not an option at all. Like you can't even choose it. Like I looked all over for it. I cannot find it. Like you have an LVM option, you have a custom partitioning option in there. You do not have a ZFS option.
Really?
The desktop version does. Now, like I said, I'm still kind of exploring this a bit, and I need to look at the message boards and news groups and things and kind of find out what's going on here because we don't have the release notes yet. They'll release the release notes tomorrow. But as of today, I could tell you that unless I'm completely blind, there's no ZFS option on the server version. And that has me very perplexed because they're all about ZFS. They've been talking about it for a long time. They've removed the experimental heading from the desktop version, but the server version doesn't even have it.
Weird.
It's very weird. So I don't know what to make of this yet. It's still, pending. So that's maybe something we'll follow up on in a future episode. Maybe even at PenguinCon we'll mention that because, maybe by then I'll get my answer. But I just wanted to mention that because it just is so weird to me. It seems like desktops are going to benefit from ZFS to a point, assuming you have like, really good hardware. But servers, I would argue, would probably want that more. I don't know. I'll look into it
Yeah.
more.
I
It
feel that way too. But I guess as long as you can
perfect.
add it, it may not be your boot device, but
Right.
maybe you set it. It's easier to set up hopefully easier to set up in a new version as a storage pool option for your data store, where you're going to put wherever critical data, databases, and things like that on there.
Yeah, previous releases of Ubuntu, if you chose ZFS, at least on the desktop, it would take a snapshot before you update, which is great because that way, I mean, how many problems in Linux would be solved by something like this? For example, think about Arch Linux. If it had ZFS snapshots or some other kind of built-in snapshot system, And you know how Arch Linux is. It's a great distro. Every now and then there could be an update that could cause some problems. And how cool would it be to just roll it back as if you never did the update? And Ubuntu on the desktop gave us that. And I haven't had a chance to test that yet on the desktop version because I'm still also doing the review that I'm going to be releasing tomorrow. But that's a real benefit, though. If you think about it, ZFS snapshots is a huge benefit for servers if that's something that you could take advantage of.
Yeah, someone mentioned, and I don't think this is the case anymore since they've moved everything to like the OpenZFS, but there may be a licensing concern. But I think those licensing concerns with the OpenZFS are mostly gone now. Because
Um,
FreeBSD used ZFS, but then everything is migrated to the. I'm not an expert on this particular topic,
right.
but I believe I understand that everything's moved to OpenZFS now.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I went on the OpenZFS page this morning when I started looking into why it might not be there on the server version. And it doesn't say why, but as of today, the OpenZFS page for Ubuntu 2204 says that, because they have like pages for distributions if you want to take advantage of OpenZFS. So if you choose the Ubuntu 2204 option, they say don't use the server version of the ISO image. They literally call out like you can't use that if you want to set up ZFS on 2204. They literally tell
Oh,
you don't use the server edition. What? So again, that's just kind of interesting. So other than that, there's not a whole lot of changes on the server version. There is one more that I've noticed, and it's the minimal mode is built in to the installer for the server version, but I don't think we can confuse that with the mini.iso. Some people might remember previous versions of Ubuntu Server had the mini.iso that had this ridiculous, it's like a ridiculous download size of like 50 megabytes. I think at one point the ISO might have hit 75 megabytes. And I did say megabytes, I'm not misquoting here. It was this ridiculously small image for Ubuntu Server you can download that gives you a very bare bones Ubuntu Server installation. I've always liked that because I didn't like all the bells and whistles that they throw in there. And they pretty much they've sunsetted that, unfortunately, and I couldn't find it for this release either.
huh.
But when you install Ubuntu Server with the ISO image for this version, it has a minimal option right there in the selection. Now, it might be a last minute bug, but I chose that this morning thinking that maybe that's the equivalent of the mini.iso. It had a 4 gig install size for the minimal version. I'm like, wait, what? That's minimal?
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't seem very minimal to me. So it could be an error where I chose, the minimal mode and it didn't give me the minimal mode, but I'm again still looking into that. But that is something you'll see in the installer when you go to install it. Other than that, though, the Ubuntu server version has all the updated packages you would expect it to have, but that's about it. So I think the desktop version is going to be probably a big portion of what we're going to talk about today, because if this was the Ubuntu server episode over, done. Let's
Yeah.
move on because there's
That's all.
something else to talk about.
Well, but we're kind of happy with minimal changes in the server, so there's not
Right.
too much going on. Because if you want to update, granted, you're going to be coming off of a several years back, so these updates are. I guess it depends on where you compare updates. Are we comparing updates to 2110 compared to server,
Right.
or are we going all the way back to the previous long term? And by the way, as you mentioned, with a 5-year cycle, is someone still on a 5-year-old, really old system? So to them, it's a big update. So there's a lot of incremental changes. So it kind of
Right.
depends on your perspective from where these changes are, but it's still a refresh. So there's still that. It's going to be interesting. It's weird they dropped the minimal install, but at least they have a mini installer. So
Yeah,
that is a
assuming that it works the way I think it should, which it'll be interesting. I'm thinking about doing a review of Ubuntu server separate from the desktop version, but I'm thinking that might be a boring review because what am I going to show? Like a blinking cursor and a bash prompt the whole time while I review it because there's no GUI? I'm not saying there should be a GUI, but I'm just not sure how exciting an Ubuntu server review will be. I'll think about that off camera and I might decide to find a way to do that. And that'll give me a chance to really dive in. I'm doing the book anyway, so I'm diving into all these things and I'm going to understand the answers to everything I brought up today for sure by then. Um, the desktop version, oh God.
one question about the other, because
Yeah.
I know the desktop version has this for a little while. Did the server version get a AD setup? And I seen someone ask that in the
Hmm.
comments, but I don't really see the use case for that as much. Not for server. Maybe I'm wrong, and maybe I'm just not understanding that you'd want to
Well,
tie your servers. I understand tying the desktops to it, so you're tying it to your Microsoft Active Directory server. But what about server doing it? I don't. Is that something they would add? That seems
I
kind of an odd
didn't see it. I'm not saying that it's not there. If I would have dived in deeper, I didn't see it.
one.
I
Okay.
do agree that there's less of a case for that on the server. However, it can be argued that, and a lot of companies I've worked for, even the system administrators themselves would be in Active Directory. And when someone that works as a sysadmin wants to get on a server and fix something, they have to have whatever AD group added to their profile to log into the server. So there is a case for that. It may not be as big of one, but it is still something that a lot of companies do. And it would be a good idea for them to add that in. But I wasn't looking for it, but I feel like I would have noticed that if I had saw it though. But we'll see. Maybe don't quote me on that.
Yeah.
I will let you guys know. But the option is definitely there in the desktop version. It's been
Yes.
there for a few releases now.
Yes.
So it wasn't in 2004, but it was in, I think, 21, was it 2110 or 2104? I think it was 2104 if I'm not mistaken.
That sounds right.
And yeah, and so that means it just missed the last LTS release. So even though this feature isn't new, it's new to a lot of people, because if they're coming from 2004, then they have that option now, whereas they may not have considered the interim releases before that. So it's definitely there in the desktop version for sure. So speaking of the desktop version, and this is what's going to come out in my review tomorrow. So I think, because I'm still doing the review, so I could change my mind last minute as I explore it more, but I'm pretty final on the review. It's the most mixed opinion I've ever had for an Ubuntu release ever in the whole entire history of the project. Because there's a lot of good in the desktop release, but there's a lot of like, what were they thinking moments that are on there too that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense for an LTS. So I think at least I try to be a glass half full kind of person as much as I can. So I will just talk about the good things first, and then I'll talk about the things that drive me crazy. So good things, GNOME 42, which I'm a fan of GNOME. So I was really happy when Ubuntu switched back to GNOME back in 1804, which was great for me because at the time my daily driver was Ubuntu GNOME. So I kind of felt like it was this moment when they switched back to GNOME that was like, yeah, I guess I made the right choice in using Ubuntu GNOME, because that's the direction Ubuntu itself is going anyway. Now, there's a lot of people that like Unity, and we're really sad to see that go back then. But they have been fairly good up to recently when it comes to getting Ubuntu back to the old way, which, for those that don't know, the way that Ubuntu used to be is they literally created their release cycle around GNOME. So it was like a month after a new version of GNOME came out, then Ubuntu would come out. And it was just this one-to-one relationship with GNOME that was great. And when they went to Unity, it kind of felt like Ubuntu just went into a different direction, which is not bad. They could go in whatever direction they want to go in. But when they went back to Ubuntu, or excuse me, when they went back to GNOME in 1804, then it's like, now we're getting back to the way Ubuntu used to be. And now we have GNOME 42, which is great. The desktop, I'm going to be doing a separate Raspberry Pi review. So that's on my list, but I've read that they've made some sort of patches into GNOME to make it run decently on Raspberry Pi, whereas GNOME generally doesn't. So I'm really curious to run the new Ubuntu on a Raspberry Pi and see how performant it is, because the previous version was sluggish as heck. On a Raspberry Pi, it was barely usable. So if they did patch that to make that not an issue anymore, that would be really great. They also added this accent color thing, which has been talked about all over the news, which is really cool because you could go from light mode, dark mode, and then you could also choose the accent color. They have a whole bunch of different color selections here, which is great because theming in GNOME is basically a travesty. So
Yeah.
I feel like the fact that they did this gives you the ability to personalize your experience without going to gnomelook.org and just hoping that the theme maintainer has updated their themes and didn't break anything in other apps when you sideload a theme into GNOME, because that's kind of how it goes. So by Ubuntu adding this, which is custom to Ubuntu, you won't see this into the new Fedora or any other GNOME distro. It's a custom feature in Ubuntu that's really nice. And I can make the accent color green because I can. That's pretty cool. So
You could theme it to the Learn Linux TV channel, and that's I think where you're going with that.
Well, yeah, you can kind of. I don't see an option to come up with your own like hex value for colors. You probably could if you went in the config file, but there's probably something like a dozen or more. I haven't didn't count them, but there's a lot of different options. There's even like 2 or 3 shades of green, I think. So it's really cool to be able to customize the desktop like that. It's just you know, GNOME is fixing this the right way, but it didn't make this release of GNOME 42. So they're doing their own thing to make this not an issue for everybody. But in the meantime, Ubuntu feels like they could just make it better for everyone right now. And the fact that they did this in an LTS release, that's pretty cool. It was ballsy because, generally they don't want to have custom tweaks like that in an LTS release, but they did. And I think it's all the better for it.
Yeah, that's it's interesting because I think of the Linux desktop going back forever ago in its earliest days was very customizable, and it's like
Yep.
we brought it down with Ubuntu to be a very boring. I don't get my cool, fancy, wobbly window effects as easily. You don't. I know there's add-ons and things like
Right.
that, but I feel like we actually dumbed down the desktop. But maybe that's what it needed to be to grow because a lot of people aren't as excited about wobbly windows as I am. So like the people who go, no, I just need to get work done,
Right.
can use it, and they want interface consistency. And this is something that the people who are not directly in tech, the general users, and you look at this at Windows, the interface stability is a big topic. That's why it's so upsetting to people when Microsoft has made changes to the desktop to workflows and things like that. The general workers who go, I just want to come in here and do the thing I do. Now they got to figure out where the thing they do is. And so there's something to be said for interface stability and not
There
too
really is.
customizing it. So,
Which is the reason why Ubuntu Mate exists, to be honest, because
yeah.
it kind of keeps that old way going. And it's GNOME in general that kind of removed a lot of customization and went. I mean, I don't think in the history of using using computers and learning about technology, I don't think I've ever seen as drastic of a change between GNOME 2 and GNOME 3. It was such a huge change. Like normally it's a matter of what's changed. Like if you're going from, I don't know, Windows XP to Vista back in the day, right? It's very different, but you still have a start button. You still have a panel. You still have the core concepts. Yeah, Vista was horrible, but it was still recognizable as Windows. But with GNOME, I mean, they removed pretty much everything and started over. I mean, it looked completely different, which is why Unity pretty much existed. So throughout the Linux ecosystem, GNOME changed styles from being very customizable to being the set it and forget it desktop. And here Ubuntu is, putting all their new changes into there that wasn't there in and of itself. So I feel like they're doing a good thing and a bad thing, which I'll get to the bad reason later. But some of their patches, like triple frame buffer support, they patched that in to GNOME. That's not there in GNOME 42. So you could kind of tell that somebody at Canonical is really paying attention to the desktop to make it faster, and they're listening to complaints because they made it like really fast. They even patched the Raspberry Pi version, like I mentioned. So there's a lot of good here. But now we get to the other side why I'm mixed, because I just mentioned that they made a lot of good decisions, but they made some really questionable decisions. And it's really strange that I feel like they're looking out for the user in all these tweaks, but they're also not because of the bad sides. So when I say it has GNOME 42, I told the truth, but I also told a lie. It's not really GNOME 42. That's the first problem. I'm dubbing this version of GNOME as implemented in Ubuntu Franken-GNOME. Not GNOME, it's Franken-GNOME, because it's a hodgepodge of just all kinds of different versions of the components. Whereas I test Fedora 36, which is coming out next week. Everything is synced to GNOME 42. Everything. Like you look at the version numbers of the apps, everything I looked at, 42 across the board. It's got GNOME 42. You look at Ubuntu, you have like GNOME settings 41 instead of 42. You have GNOME terminal 3.44 instead of the GNOME console that they came out with. You have gedit, I think it's also version 41 or 3.44 when they switched to a new text editor. Quite a few components are just not at version 42. They're just
Huh.
not. So it's like you have some of GNOME 42, and when you go to the settings screen, so it's kind of funny. You go into GNOME settings, which is GNOME settings 41, and GNOME settings 41 reports your GNOME version as 42. You can't make this up. And
Weird.
you have these outdated apps everywhere. And the reason why they say that this is the case is because they were really scared to implement GTK4 in the LTS release because they didn't feel like it received enough testing, which is interesting because they held back GNOME 40 for a whole release cycle. And then they forced us to be one major version of GNOME behind before this. And now they're complaining that it didn't get enough testing. Well, of course it didn't. You didn't let us test it. You didn't even give us the chance to test it. So why are you guys coming out with interim releases, which, can be argued they exist to test bleeding edge software leading up to an LTS? So they didn't let us test bleeding edge software leading up to the LTS, and now they're holding it back again by giving us this hodgepodge of weird versions. It just doesn't make any sense to me at all.
So if you're not done with your review, Jay, I'm going to say that the comment I seen here is great. GNOME 41 3/4.
Oh my gosh, I don't know if I have to patch that in at this point. I think it's a little bit too late at this point because
Okay.
the review is very far along to the point where I'm just doing B-roll and I have to check it against the final release to make sure everything I say is still true. But I just call it in the review Franken-gnome, and that's exactly what it is. It's just a good and bad thing because I feel like their focus on stability is a good thing. Their custom patches are a good thing. Their attention to detail is a good thing. There's attention to detail everywhere. They themed every aspect of the GNOME desktop, but it's just not really GNOME. It's like I think it's the Perseus paradox, if I'm saying that right, where if you replace, I think it's like if you replace a board of
All
the
the
ship.
parts of the ship before you build it. Yeah.
Yeah, at what point does it become a brand new ship? So I think we can argue at what point does Ubuntu 2204's implementation of GNOME, when is it its own thing? And when I was looking back at Ubuntu 1804 in Mark Shuttleworth talking about this, the decision was to stop developing a desktop, Unity, right? They got rid of that. So he didn't think there's a value in developing their own desktop. So they synced back to GNOME, which is great. They added a panel, which I thought was okay because Unity had a panel, so that would avoid some confusion from users at update. But I feel like they have redeveloped Unity again because they're just going all over the place with GNOME. That it's like, what is this actually? Should we just call this GNOME Unity or Unity GNOME at this point? It's just so
It's
confusing. I don't even know what to think about this.
I know what I think. I'm going to stay with Papa Wes. That's my opinion so far.
But then the problem there is Pop! OS is going to have the same problem because they
Yes.
base on GNOME, and they're developing their own desktop environment. My understanding is it's not ready yet. It's not going to be in the new Pop! OS, which I'm pretty sure Pop! OS comes out next week. So that's pretty cool. But I think this might be, I haven't asked them this at System 76, but this might even be why they're doing that because they can't even keep up with what Ubuntu is doing and they're basing on it. Then I guess it makes sense to do their own desktop because how else are they going to be in control of that?
Yeah, no, that makes complete sense. And like you said, there's also a reason the Ubuntu Mate exists and why it's so popular.
Right. So the elephant in the room that I have to talk about is snap packages because you can't even have a conversation about Ubuntu nowadays without that entering the conversation. And you can't even like make a comment anywhere online. Anything
There's a lot of
Ubuntu
debate
related
about
without
these.
somebody saying snap packages. And I've seen at least one comment go through the live stream already. So you can set your watch to this. You say Ubuntu, someone else says snap packages. So snap packages, I feel like, get a lot of unfair criticism because it's a technology that I think is sound in the reason why it exists, because it's a real problem nowadays where you have a developer, let's just say a developer that makes apps for Windows and Mac OS, and they're kind of thinking about Linux, but they're not really sure. And if you think about it, they look at Linux and they're like, okay, so let's target Linux. What do I got to do? Oh, I got to make an RPM. Wait, how many RPMs? I got to do one for SUSE, Fedora, CentOS, and I have to make a deb package for Debian as well as Ubuntu, and then Arch is its own thing. And nah, I'm good. I'm just not going to do it. And that's kind of the problem that a lot of companies have had. Now, obviously, a lot of people will counter argue that my description of the scenario might not be completely valid, but this is their mindset, not mine. This is what they go through. So snap packages and universal packages in general come along because we want to give developers a way to target the Linux and platform with one thing, but we also have flat packs and app images, so we can never really have one thing, can we? Now, in some ways, I'll defend snap packages because they make sense why they exist, but the problem is they did not fix that slow to start issue. So you click on Firefox and the first time, it takes an ungodly amount of time. Like, I was thinking people are over exaggerating with this. And I literally have a part in the video, and I'm giving all kinds of spoilers here, but where I have a message. This is not being edited, on the screen while I launch Firefox and then wait for it to come up. And I have an SSD. It's actually an NVMe. There's no reason for it to be that slow. And this isn't a new complaint at all. People have been complaining about this for quite a while. So I don't understand why Canonical would move Firefox into a snap package if it has a very big flaw that they just don't seem to care to address in any way, shape, or form. It just doesn't make sense.
Even some of them, I think there's times to use them and there's times not to. It seems to do well with some things, but I've run into that same slow problem with Snap. And I've also seen some flat packs, and me and you had discussed this before, where it had trouble doing USB driver talk. It was specifically, remember the YubiKey problem. If you installed it via Flatpak, the YubiKey controller was just not working properly. To remove it from Flatpak to a normal packaged install worked perfectly fine. So there's always a little quirkiness with the packaging on there, which leads me to be thinking, do we need to focus on a package manager as opposed to all of them, so we can make one good one and solve problems with it versus having more? I mean, I'm all for a diverse ecosystem in some extent, but at some point you can't, everyone arguing about them and then them not performing well individually. Like, put all your collectiveness together, figure out which package manager we're going to do, and optimize it so we can have a good user experience with it. And I'll also add a comment, because I was doing the Wireshark video today, and Wireshark as a flat pack had errors in it that I didn't get. Like when I was connecting with SSH, it gives an error, but it doesn't really tell me why it won't work. It's kind of vague. It tells me that the authentication fails, but not why the authentication fails. But doing it via the package install works perfectly fine with exactly the same parameters for our authentication into an SSH server. So I've run into some weird issues just in general with some of those package managers, and on top of the slow issue.
No, you're right. I mean, there are some things that need to be fixed. I feel like a lot of times the issues with snap packages just seem to stand out more because it's got to be upsetting, right? If let's just say you buy a bunch of parts, you're going to build a computer and you bought some really expensive, super powerful parts, and this desktop, man, this thing is going to be like cruising because it's just so good. Just to launch Firefox and have to wait a long time for it to run on your super fast computer. It just makes even though it's just one app, and there's other apps too, but it just makes your system seem slow, and that to me is a bad thing. And my opinion in this is going to be a little controversial. I feel that with Canonical's decision to make Firefox a snap package in the new Ubuntu, they've killed snap packages. There's no hope for it to succeed now. They have literally put it the rest of the way in the coffin. And here's why I say that. Remember the controversy around ButterFS some years ago?
Yeah.
So ButterFS has never recovered from that reputation, even though they may have fixed whatever the problem was back then that, caused the problem. The thing with the Linux community is that reputation seems to last longer in the Linux community than in any other community other than maybe Star Wars, because let's be honest, we're still complaining about those other movies like years and years later. But in the Linux community, reputation is everything. So here's the thing. Ubuntu puts out this release. Let's just give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they have, or they'll fix the slow to launch issue with snap packages the first week of release, or maybe second. Okay. That sounds great, but they put it out the door with that problem right from the ISO. They have created another reputation issue, and it'd be hard enough for them to, get snap packages in the reputation fixed now. It's really going to be hard now that an LTS release has slow software that clearly has a problem. And I feel like that's going to make people dislike snap packages more. So At this point, I am going to predict that in 2 years, they're going to sink to Flatpak.
I hope so.
And I'll say this: I have been a defender of snap packages for a long time. I do feel the technology is good, other than the fact that you can't have your own repository; it has to be the one. It's a walled garden, and the fact that apps launch slowly. But other than that, like if they would fix those issues, I feel like snap packages would be such a great technology. I totally understand why they did this, and I feel like their mind was in the right place. But the way that it worked out has just caused a lot of frustration. And I feel like if they would have held the technology back longer and kind of perfected it better before releasing it, I don't know if half as many people would be complaining about it now as they are. And here we are with a new 5-year release that uses snap packages. It'll be very interesting to see how this plays out for sure.
Yeah, like I said, I'm just actively avoiding them.
Yeah, and that seems to be the mentality for most people. And that's okay, because if you install something on your machine, you can remove it if you want. I feel like it's this big tug-of-war match because Canonical is a company. So to be completely fair, even though people don't want to hear this, they could do with Ubuntu as they please. I'm not saying they should make bad decisions, but when you use a distribution that is, made by a company and has company backing, you have to expect company shenanigans. You just have to, because companies are going to be companies and they're going to make bad decisions. So it's interesting when people say, they're using Ubuntu, but then they're upset at Ubuntu for the snap packages. And then I'm thinking, well, you decided to use a distribution that's backed by a company. If you feel that strongly about a company's decisions, you probably should be using Debian, to be honest. But it is what it is. But at the same time, Canonical has the right to push snap packages, and then you, as the user, you have a right to purge it.
Yeah,
I mean, fair is fair, right?
simple as that. And
so,
in the big picture, don't let anyone. And I seen someone comment about being newer to the Linux world. These are some nuanced things and shouldn't overall impact your desire to get started in Linux or used as a reason not to get into Linux. Pick a distro, stick with it. Ubuntu's not a bad distro for people getting started. Distro. It's still where I tell a lot of people to get started, because it's not because I think it's the best distro ever, as much as it's got a really popular user base. It's easy to find and search and the things you're looking for, or Pop! OS, because it's based on Ubuntu. Yep. So an error you find or a challenge you may have setting something up in Pop! OS, generally speaking, is going to translate easily to that, copy paste into Google and find an answer to your problem. That's a huge advantage, because you're going to have as a new person starting out, you're going to have the same questions a lot of other people have. So don't Jay not liking the GNOME and 41 3/4 is not a reason not to use Ubuntu still as your starting point.
And I think that's a good thing that you brought that up, because there's going to be a lot of people that really don't care about FrankenGNOME. Like it's just like, it works. They have a file manager. They can get to their browser. They can open up a terminal, get their work done, or whatever it is they do. They don't care, right? I think a lot of people won't care about that. So my criticism of the GNOME implementation is not aligned with the user so much, because a lot of users won't care. It's more along the lines of the community and the harm that it might do, because it is going to cause more confusion. Because if you think about it, if someone uses Ubuntu with GNOME 42, then they decide to try out Fedora with GNOME 42, they're going to probably think, why are these features so different between them when they're supposed to be the exact same software base? And that's going to cause a confusion. So that's really where my problem is that this isn't going to help anybody. And I also feel like the reasons why Canonical did this doesn't add up, because other distributions have no problem whatsoever implementing all of GNOME 42, including Fedora. So whatever problem they think they have, I just don't really feel like it holds any water. But you're right. The average person uses it, they're going to like it. And I'll say that Ubuntu still has among the best hardware compatibility of any Linux distribution on the planet, period. Like I see people saying, I use Debian. That's great. You are going to have a much higher chance on Debian of having incompatible hardware, because they do the worst job of actually supporting hardware of any distro, whereas Ubuntu does the best, which is kind of weird. But if Debian works in your hardware, you're going to love it, because it's so fantastic. Like, Debian is just wonderful. Like, the like everything about it, like that's my only complaint is hardware support. And the only thing better than hardware support on Ubuntu is going to be Pop! OS, because they take what Ubuntu has already done, then they give you like additional features like custom NVIDIA drivers, like a
Yes.
custom NVIDIA version altogether. So gaming works better on it. They have additional hardware support on top of it. So I would say Pop! OS is number one when it comes to hardware compatibility. Ubuntu is number two, and that's still the case now. So here I am complaining about snap packages and GNOME 42, but if you don't care about that Franken GNOME thing and you just remove the snap package for Firefox, you can literally just download the tarball of Firefox from Mozilla directly and fix that problem instantaneously. Like, done. Like, not only is it going to fix the problem, but if you download the tarball from Mozilla and run that, you will get updates straight from Mozilla the minute that Firefox is released, and you don't even have to wait for a package manager to update. So you could argue that that's just a better solution in general for Firefox.
It's one of the things. I do use Chrome for my business, and I like the fact that I'm getting the Chrome updates because they are necessary. And the same thing with Firefox. Your browser is how you're interfacing.
Mhm.
The internet is got lots of threats, and lots of them are embedded in web pages. The most likely and common way these exploits are moving towards getting exploited is through, anything they can get you to download and run something in a browser, maybe a flaw on a page. So these are pretty real threats. So I always think of browsers as something that just has such a high attack surface. You have to keep them up to date. And both Firefox and Chrome have been really good at doing this and keeping those updates rolling. So you want to make sure you don't lose that connectivity on there, because whether you're
Yep.
using Windows or Linux, that still is the big threat surface that is common across both platforms. Now, granted, for Linux, if the threat actors are getting in, they're generally looking for Windows execution environment, but it's not to say they couldn't do something for Linux if there's a flaw in the browser that allows them in. So keeping that up to date is
Yep.
hugely key to staying safe.
My suggestion for Firefox, for those of you that want to do this, I might make a video about this, I'm not sure yet, is to download the tarball. And yeah, that gives you the ability to update directly from Mozilla. But what I recommend doing is doing a chown on that entire Firefox folder, make it owned by root, but you're running it as your user, not root. And that does disable the ability for it to automatically update. But you could just chown it back to your user, update it, and then chown it back to root. Because if something did get into the browser, you really wouldn't want the browser running as your user, because if the browser, all the files of the browser are owned by the same user running it, and that user gets something in there, then obviously somebody could just start replacing files. But if you make it owned by root when you're running it, then you're basically adding a layer of protection. And when Mozilla says, hey, we have a new version, then you just chown the whole thing, make it owned by your user, update it, then switch it back. It's probably the most secure way to run it. Plus, you avoid that snap problem with it loading really slowly. So in that case, that could be the best solution for most people, I think.
Yeah, but then people won't update it. And that's why I'm not going
Yeah,
to
that's
say that's the
true.
best. Yeah. Because once you say I
Well,
got to CH own it back and forth, now we've gotten off topic.
that's true. Yeah, no, you're right, because updates are always a problem, aren't they? But I think the bigger problem could be the fact that I'm noticing that as my hair becomes more and more gray, I'm becoming more moody about silly changes. So
Yeah.
the problem might not be canonical at all. It could just be me.
Wait, are we
And to be
becoming those older grumpy tech people?
Yeah, I hate that. But to be fair, though, I think the average person will probably like Ubuntu 22.04 a lot. It's just the people that are more experienced and they understand the Linux community and the different components and things. I feel like that's where they're going to start to have some dislike for it if they're at that level of experience. But the average person, they'll probably say, "What is Jay saying? This desktop is awesome." That's probably going to be their opinion. But
Absolutely.
I think the takeaway here is it's going to be a mixed opinion release, as it has been for several releases now. So I don't really think that's going to be all that different.
But we will keep using it. We aren't moving back to Windows, in case anyone's wondering.
No, we're not doing that. I mean, it is the case. Like, I sometimes think about, if I get to the point where Ubuntu is too much, what would I move to? And it might even be Debian, because I know how to work around the bad hardware compatibility that it has. And I have everything written down, all the commands and things. I can copy and paste, fix the problem within like 5 minutes. Um, and as soon as you get all the drivers installed with the Debian installation, it's pretty darn good. So I think for now, this isn't enough to make me just abandon Ubuntu. I still like the platform a lot. I just feel like I just hope they can just get everything resynchronized and back to some sort of consistency, because I think it really does benefit from consistency, even if users don't always notice that.
Yeah. So the full review will be out tomorrow.
Yep.
Is that when you plan on having that release, Jay?
Yep, it's 90% done now. So
Okay.
literally probably an hour after we're done recording, it's going to be done, and all I have to do is check it against the final release. So I'm just going to hit that button when I know everything that I say is true, then is still true. Then I just hit the button, and you guys will see that review, and I will have an installation walkthrough for those that have never seen that process before. And I'll probably have some additional Ubuntu 2204 videos coming as well. So there's going to be no shortage of videos. And yeah, it starts tomorrow. So definitely stay
Awesome.
tuned for
You
that.
can download Ubuntu tomorrow, and you can watch Jay's video
Yep.
tomorrow. So you can install it while watching Jay's video.
And then not
So,
install it after you hear what I have to say. I'm just joking.
yeah.
Don't do that. Don't do that. It's fine. Don't worry, guys. It's totally fine. I'm just complaining today. They are legitimate complaints, but they don't affect everyone. Some people don't care. But what I would say is this: use it yourself and come to your own opinion. Don't take
Oh,
my
yeah.
opinion for it. Don't take anyone else's opinion for it. Don't take the opinion in the review as gospel. Download it yourself and come up with your own opinion. I think that's the best thing anybody can do. And especially when it comes to Linux, just download it.
Absolutely. To start playing, we still encourage, this is not to discourage anyone from trying it. That's for sure.
Right.
So,
Right.
all right. This has been episode 53 that should have been about DNS, but instead was about
Yeah.
Ubuntu.
Yep. We missed episode 42 doing something with that. And now 53. So the next episode number that stands out, we're gonna have to really do something for it.
123. That'll be time for a good episode number, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was a good dad joke there.
There we go. Hey, NTP jokes are all about the timing.
That's what you said in the video.
Yep.
Go watch my April Fool's video if you haven't seen it yet.
Yes, it's always DNS. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. And for those of you that will see us in person, me and Jay will both be at PenguinCon. We have a few talks we're doing and everything else. So if you see us there, come say hi. All right.
Yep,
Take care, everyone. Later.
Later.